comes in three parts. Any rate study includes a revenue requirement, and what that is, it's based on your budget, is how much revenue do you need to run the utility for a year in the future. So we base this on your 2020 budget and also your projections for 2021 to 25. And the next step in that process is to do a cost of service and cost allocation. And what that is basically is, do a study based on industry standards that says that who drives the cost should pay for those costs. Now, there's a difference between the cost of service and cost allocation and rate design, because the rate design is designing the customer rates, but every utility has decades and decades of embedded rate history and how they built their rates, what kind of customer classes they have, and so on. And those rates may not necessarily reflect the cost of service to those customer classes. So the two are, it's like the art and science. The science is the cost of service, industry standards based on your customer loads profile and so on. And the rate design is the part of it that has evolved over time and changes as your priorities change, and your strategy changes and things like that as well. But when you look at your revenue requirement components, so based on your budget for 2020, that's what this chart is here. So of course, the biggest area is the power supply expenses. And you can see the rest of the expenses, your payment in lieu of tax to the town, depreciation, administrative and general, and you see the other categories here as well. So this makes up that pot of costs in total from your budget that needs to be recovered from your customers through their customer rates. And when we look at the revenue requirement components, one thing we like to do is, what has changed between now and your last study? So your last study was done in 2014. And down the left-hand side of this slide are all the various components of your revenue requirement that you saw in the previous graph that we had here. And you can see that the differences and the changes in power supply, of course, has gone up. Some transmission, distribution expenses have gone up, and this is 6 years ago, so you would expect things to increase. Customer accounting is up, customer accounts expenses are up rather, administrative in general, and depreciation, payment in lieu of tax to the town, and so on. So overall, your revenue requirement in this study compared to the last one, the revenue requirement has gone up slightly over 13%. So we do that to get a feel on, how the numbers look and if we're headed in the right direction. And of course, it's all, the foundation of this is your budget for 2020. So then we take that revenue requirement and we allocate that revenue requirement to customer classes based on load curves and cost causation principles. And what that says is this, and cost causation says, if you can determine that a rate class has caused the cost, they should get allocated that particular cost. And then you have other costs that are left over, like administrative in general, maybe your CARES program, things like that, where there isn't a direct one-to-one relationship of that. So you use other industry standards to allocate those costs to every customer class on a defensible allocation basis as well. And so what you end up with are what we call rate class subsidies. So for example, we're going to see in another slide or two that some classes are over their cost of service and some are under their cost of service. So that means the number at the bottom in total doesn't change, but some classes are subsidizing others. And the idea is to eventually move or look at cost of service on a regular basis and try to move your customer classes to their cost of service over a period of time so that you can ensure revenue stability and adequate cash flow, and that you also avoid rate shock to your customer classes. In other words, you don't want rates that bounce around like this. You want a nice smooth progression of rates either up or down to move to that cost of service. And everything is driven by your customer load data. So we, from your billing system, we received all of the load data by customer class, in great detail, the demand, the energy, customer counts, things like that. And then using that, we are able to input that into a cost of service study, which has industry standard cost functionalization allocators that say for each particular item in your budget, in your infrastructure plan and service, this is how the cost should be allocated, then based on that customer data. So it's tailored to CMLP, but it's based on industry standards that are pretty common in the industry. So what those industry standards also do is divide the costs into 4 different buckets. The demand bucket, which is how big do you need to build your facilities to meet the peak demands of the system. So your hottest day or your coldest day, everyone has their AC on or their heating on, all your industry is humming, things like that. What is the size of your system that you have to build to meet that peak demand for CMLP? The second cost category is your energy costs category, which is the kilowatt hours. So that's the costs associated with the consumption of energy. Then you have your customer costs, which are costs incurred to serve customers without regard to usage. So this is costs like your billing and collecting, your accounting and finance, your CARES program, things of that nature, which don't vary according to usage, but need to be recovered from all the customers. And then there's direct assignment costs, which are incurred to serve specific customers. The best example I have of that would be street lighting. So you can take your street lighting costs, allocate that to street lighting, maintenance of street lights, the street light depreciation, recovery, and things like that. So those would be the direct assignment costs. Okay. So then the next step in the process is to compare those costs of service to the forecasted revenues in your budget. And what we had found in our study that proportionally, the cost of service had shifted slightly towards the residential customer class from other classes compared to your last rate study. And what that leads to is this summary schedule here, and I'll do a walkthrough of this. There's a lot of detail on here, but in any case, down this column here, the customer class, these are the customer classes in your current rate tariffs. The cost of service is the calculated cost of service for each customer class. So that in total, we determine based on your budget and other factors that the cost of service is roughly $28 million. You compare that to the forecasted revenues at current rates, and that is this column here. So overall, you can see that cost of service and revenues are right on target. I mean, which is always a good thing. Some utilities you work for, you walk in and there's, a big negative number here, which means there's a large rate increase that's needed just to meet the cost of service. But here you're pretty spot on with the forecast and the cost of service as we determine. But in each customer class, you can see a negative or a positive number. And what that says is that a positive number says that this particular customer class, their cost of service is higher than what you're recovering in revenues from that particular customer class. So for example, the residential class has a negative 2 million. So based on this analysis, it says that residential revenues are about 18% under their cost of service. Now, in my experience and our firm's experience, and in the industry, that is not real uncommon at all. The trend, if you go back 15, 20 or more years, the trend in the electric business was that the general service, industrial customer rates generally subsidize residential rates. And that was a very common thing. And now the pendulum has swung the other way, where utilities are looking at this and saying, well, we probably want to move more towards cost of service. And so we're looking at differences like that and saying maybe a gap like that would need to be addressed. But a couple of factors come into play. So first off, this cost of service study is based on your current load data at a snapshot in time. And if you want to get comfortable with the trend and direction of the rates, you would want to do a cost of service analysis on a regular basis. And one of the deliverables in the work that we're doing for you is the model that we have developed that is tailored to you, so that you can take a look at this on a regular basis to get a good feel and comfort in the direction of cost of service and how that relates to the revenues from current rates. For residential, we see that difference. As we look down the stack of numbers here, there are differences up or down. Really, your entire operation is mainly driven on the revenue side by your residential and your general service customers. I mean, every class is important, of course, but when it comes to moving a number up or down or whatever, those are the two main revenue sources that you have for customers. So, for example, you see this 18% difference in residential. If we look down here in the general service area, you can see that general service is generally, excuse the pun, their revenues are higher than their cost of service. And again, that is not anything unusual that we have found in our work with similar studies. So just one moment, please. So in our initial draft of this study, which is still a rough draft, which will be edited as we move ahead here, we had some basic observations and recommendations that came out of that. There are a lot more than this, but I wanted to hit the high points of that. And our first observation is that our current rates in total meet the current cost of service. And as we recommend to any client that we work for in this realm, the customer rates should eventually move towards their cost of service under the cost causation theory. And again, it's something that should happen over time, be reviewed on a regular basis so that you make sure that your course, the way you're steering the ship is on a fairly straight line and not zigzagging all over the place. So we do recommend that you undergo regular cost of service studies, and you'll have the tool to do that as well. And one of the things that was requested in your request for proposal that we proposed on is that you wanted to move to an opt-out residential time of use rate eventually. So as you get more data, you install more smart meters, you will have that data to determine how the usage patterns will evolve from customers that are in that class that do not opt out. And I have a slide coming up here to dig into what I mean there in just a little more detail. So we'll get back to that in just a moment. So again, as you install more smart meters, a residential demand rate should become part of your rate structure in order to send price signals to customers on their electricity usage. So residential demand rates are becoming more prevalent in utilities, but again, they're dependent on the smart meter data that you get. Well, and then to avoid rate shock, a transition plan should be used to move customer rate classes to their cost of service. And in your request for services, you talked about a 5-year transition plan, and our report will include that when it's finalized with the rate design. Okay. And it moves us to the rate design consideration. Again, we're not there yet, but these are things to think about and discuss here as part of the study. So again, having a frequent cost of service study allows your rates to move towards the cost of service, and the rates philosophy that you have, and you have spelled that pretty well out in your strategic plan, well, that rate philosophy should fit with the strategic plan goals. And again, that rate-making process that you're going through now, I think will help you really, achieve that strategy that you're seeking in your long-range plan. So to highlight some specific areas here, in the rate design consideration, your revenues are driven mainly by the residential and general service classes. Again, every class is equally as important. You have different strategies for each rate class and things like that, but the majority of your rate design is going to be driven by what you decide with the residential and general service. So if residential is under and general service is over, a rate design would be for those to cross somewhere along the line. But again, the idea is the financial health of CMLP as an organization. So any rate design should keep that in consideration. The next focus that you had was time of use rates. So again, that philosophy and incentive for customers to change their behavior to move usage off peak to lower your peak, which benefits all your customers because it lowers your costs. And part of the rate design process will need to determine what rate differential will cause customers to seek to change their time of use of electricity, to move their use of electricity to off-peak hours. And the other area that to consider is fixed charges. Now, your strategic plan called for an increase in your monthly customer charge toward $30 per residential customer. Now, in the cost of service study, and this is for CMLP, we found that your monthly residential fixed costs are about $122 per customer per month, including power-related demand charges. And once you take out those related demand charges and those demand costs, the customer charge would be about $71 per customer per month. And you're probably thinking, well, how could that possibly be? Well, again, that is not uncommon in the municipal or investor-owned utility arena. In fact, our report has a section on it on fixed customer monthly charges for utilities of your size in your region, across the country, things like that. I off the top of my head, I don't think any of the monthly charges top $20 per month, and yours is at $12. So you say, well, what costs and accounts are part of the customer fixed charge? Well, the fixed costs in a utility, the fixed power supply cost would be something that lends itself to a fixed customer demand cost charge rather. And the rest of these pieces of each of these expenses, so depreciation, substation, distribution, meter operation, services, meter reading, and billing, have a fixed cost component that you can argue should belong in the customer fixed charge. Another area that we talked about was the time of use rates. Now, the low curves really below here tell the story, and hopefully you can see that on your screen. I'm going to have to put my glasses on here for that. But the chart on the right, I'm sorry, the chart on the left is your residential hourly load data by season. So down at the very bottom is the hours of the day, okay? 0 through 24, and the load is on the axis here. So the blue is the winter season, and winter season is October 1 through May 31. And so you see that, overnight, of course, the load is low. This is winter, pretty stable during the day. And at 4 o'clock p.m., folks come home, the heat turns on, whatever occurs in that point in time, your peak for your winter system is at about 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, and then it tapers off again in the overnight hours. And the summer season, again, overnight, and then it ramps up during the day, air conditioning and more industrial load, things like that, until your system peaks at approximately 6 p.m. and 6 through 10 p.m. is your highest peak of the day. And again, it drops down overnight. So the goal of time of use rates is to flatten this curve. And so you have a time of use, your tour rate, you have a time of use rate of a subset of your residential customers. And this is what their summer winter load curve looks like. So summer is brown. You can see this is the overnight hours, low during the day, and the same with the winter as well. That's because, you in that group of customers, you have the folks that are paying really good attention to that. And also the rate differential between overnight and or off peak and on peak is pretty substantial. So the goal would be, as you move to an opt-out time of use rate, to flatten this down. But until you have more data, it's hard to tell, what the customer reaction will be to that. Initially, there may not be a lot of reaction, but eventually it would be something that would be beneficial to CMLP. So other topics to look at in the rate design, net metering is one area where you have a demand charge and then a credit based on the average day ahead, pricing in ISO New England. And so we talked through, some rate structures, do away with that fixed customer charge and instead give customers a credit based on what we call the value of solar. So how they help you avoid your peak, lower your costs, things like that. There's calculations that can be done to determine what that is that some utilities are moving to as well. And then the other class that I know is of consideration is the ETS customer class, where currently the cost of service is about 18% higher than the current revenues from that class. And, perhaps since that peak is manufactured by air control and things like that, a class like that may fit with a residential time of use rate, depending on how the technology works and if you can do that within the parameters of the time of use periods and, allow the customers that have invested in this type of technology to realize what they were looking for when they did that as well. And then, of course, one of the overriding areas in your strategic plan was beneficial electrification. So, in that area, the goals of beneficial electrification are to save your customers money. But along with that, and the idea is to hit two of these three areas at least when you do considerations. So saving money for your customers through their rates compared to the alternative sources, managing your load and your grid management, and then also having an eye towards the environment and the impacts on the environment of various decisions that you make in power supply, electric vehicles, load shaping, things like that as well. So hopefully I got a little long-winded on that, hopefully not too much, but just to bring up the data on where we are for the next steps. The next steps in this are to get input from you folks and use that input to make revisions to the cost of service analysis, do the customer rate design, come back and present that rate design to management, and then present the final report and recommendations to you again as well. Okay, so to wrap my prepared remarks up here, again, we really appreciate help of Laura and Matt on this job and in preparing this initial report and study. They spent many hours walking us through things, helping us understand data, assembling data as well. And we really appreciate all the help that they did on that. And again, we are grateful that you hired us to do this work and are very appreciative of that as well. So this is our company's contacts. Jody Dobson is the partner in charge of this project. I'm the project manager, and Peter Haney, who's not on this call here, but who did the lion's share of the analysis, and he's our cost of service wizard and spreadsheet expert when it comes to things like this. So he did a lot of the work, and with that, I'll take your questions and take it from there.
All right, so Russ, thank you very much. This was a great presentation. I know it's a very complex set of information to present, and as you said, we still have some next steps to do with this. But as I mentioned earlier, let me start by asking the board if they have specific questions about the presentation and some of the topics. And I don't know if you want to raise your hand. Oh, I guess that's Lynn. Lynn.
Well, number of us, but sure, I'll kick it off. Thank you, Russ. It's very interesting for me to see that sort of broadly our costs of service and our revenues come very close together. You said we were almost in line, which is probably a miracle, right? How often does that really happen? And yet somehow costs are allocated through your process to different rate class customers, and we end up with these variances between revenues and costs by rate class.
Mm-hmm.
Could you describe a little bit, give us some examples about how that cost allocation is done so that we end up with these divergences across rate classes?
Sure. So the mechanics of the cost of service piece are to look at your budget line by line, account by account, and then there's industry standard allocators that we use for each account. Some are fixed. You might recall the four types of costs: fixed, variable, customer, and direct. So each one of those allocators addresses what type of cost it is. So for example, a lot of your depreciation on your fixed assets, those would be fixed kind of costs because you got to build that infrastructure and it has to be available to your customers whether they use it or not. So that would be like a fixed cost to each customer class. Another cost would be more of a, variable. So some of your power supply costs are variable based on energy usage, and others are fixed based on capacity cost and things like that. And then you go line by line through the expenses. For example, maintenance overhead lines would be a cost that's, part fixed, part variable, things like that. Maintenance of substations. You move into the customer accounts categories line by line, and those would be more fixed customer costs, things like that. Your administrative and general costs are allocated based on how all the other buckets of costs are assembled and allocated. And then you take those totals and you allocate those to each customer class. You might recall the one table that you're referring to that lists the customer classes, cost of service and the revenue from current rates. But in each instance, each one of those customer classes, we take the assembled data of the kilowatt demand that they place on the system, the kilowatt hours that they use as a customer class, and compare that to the total of CMLP system, and we allocate their piece of that because they contribute to that total capacity and usage of CMLP's system. So for example, if a residential, say, I have to do easy math because math isn't my strong suit, but that's why we have spreadsheets. But in any case, say CMLP's entire demand was 1,000 kilowatts, and the residential class contributed 100 kilowatts to that. Well, they would get 10% of that particular allocation, something like that. And say the general service was 300 kilowatts, well, they would get 30% of that allocation.
So I understand the allocation of the variable cost. Are the fixed costs allocated according to those same percentages, or are they allocated in a different way?
Well, it's a lot more refined than that. The allocators, the methodology is, well, I wonder if I could show you a page out of the model, if that would help. You think that would work? Here, let me try this once. Okay, hopefully you can see the spreadsheet. Yep. Okay, so here's an example, and again, this is all, we'll keep this small and keep it for theory, but here are all in the left-hand side of your screen there. I want to blow this up just a little bit. Well, here's all the various types of energy that you have. And of course, we're going to functionalize these by cost type. Okay, so these are variable energy. So there's an allocator called purchase power energy, which mainly allocates energy costs based on kilowatt hour usage. And each customer class, this is the dollars that are allocated to them of this particular line item in your financial record. Here. like to do here. As we go down the stack of cost here, we have, you know, capacity costs allocated on a fixed basis. And then we have all the other, your distribution expenses, allocators like that. Some are a mix of fixed, some are a mix of variable. We have our customer cost expenses. You can see the list of those. Those are more customer related costs allocated based on number of customers, number of meters, things like that. And we have our administrative and general costs, which are allocated based on the allocation of all the costs that came before that. So that's the mechanics of doing that, but that's based on the forecasted load of each customer class, number of customers, you know, what their load factor is, what their kilowatt hour usage is, what their demand on the system is, when they peak compared to when your system peaks, when they peak compared on their own when your system doesn't peak. We call that non-coincident peak, and things like that. So all these are factored in to, you know, using these allocation tools that factor those variables together to come up with what should their piece of this particular line item be for that.
So Russ, it's Wendy. I just want to clarify and follow on Lynn's question. So let's take depreciation. And if it's based on customer, is a general service customer equal to a residential customer in your allocation?
No,
I'm still a little not clear how we do the fixed allocation.
Okay, so, you know, when it comes to some of those costs, you have a weighting of customers. Like a, so for example, we have a customer weighting for each customer class. So like for a residential customer is weighted as a 1, where a large general service customer is weighted as a 5. So they get a higher piece of some of those fixed customer costs and things like that.
Okay. Lynn, does that help answer your question?
Yeah, seeing the customer weights though then raises another question. Are those, or are those subjectively decided by us?
Well, you know, those we use based on, you know, our experience in doing these and, you know, what you find in other utilities and also with input in our discussions as well.
Thank you.
Russ, it's Wendy. So would you say our allocation is typical? I mean, right now you're putting a lot of 5 compared to a 1 on residential. Is that typical what you would see in the industry?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. I probably didn't explain that real clearly. It's, I don't know, it's like a, well, I hate to use the old fashioned term of peel back the onion, but there's a lot of layers that you get to come to the numbers that you see on this schedule here. There's not really a one-to-one relationship of that. It goes through some variations of allocation based on, you know, we probably use 30 different allocators for this based on, again, peak, non-coincident peak, energy usage, number of customers, things like that. And then the type of the expense that is there. These would be industry standards that are used here, which I think fit CMLP fairly well. And there's some tweaking that goes along the way based on how to split costs and things like that that we discussed with your team.
Well, it certainly helps us appreciate the complexity that's going into this. And as you said earlier, we actually have the model, so we can continue to update this and model it as we need to. Lynn, did you have other questions? I'll move on to other board members if not.
Oh, please move on.
Okay.
Gordon has his hand raised.
Gordon? Just seeing that.
Gordon, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Could we go to the page 12 with a summary of differences in cost? And my question would be, that if you look at the rightmost column, there's positive entries and negative entries.
Mm-hmm.
The one to the left of it has, you know, brackets around the negative entries. But for general service net metering, and so wherever they're always either both negative or both positive. And I see that pattern all the way down until I get to the next to the bottom, general service net metering. The two are different. There's a positive sign next to 100% and parentheses around the 10,000. So it doesn't seem consistent to me. And then just generally, what does that line mean anyway? Yeah, general service net metering. So this would be a line that looks at what the contribution to cost of service, our net metering policy, inputs or provides or causes.
It also means there's no cost for that, which that's a little odd, I guess.
Well, the net metering, excuse me. Well, the net metering customers, their costs are being picked up in some of these other classes because when they are billed, the net metering is billed as a separate component, but your billing system also issues a bill for them for their monthly customer charge, and things like that. That's my understanding.
Russ, can I have you bring that that slide up so the audience can see that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I did.
Slide
I'm
12.
sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. You see it now?
Yeah.
All right. So the cost for those customers, whoops. Okay, so the cost for these customers is so for example, if you have a residential net metering customer, they are also, you know, as part of your billing system, they are part of the R1 class. So they are getting their fixed monthly customer charge through that bill. And so that means the cost of serving them is also in this class here, in the residential class. Okay. This revenue piece, well, that's why there's no cost there, because the cost for serving these customer classes is in these other classes, depending on what rate class they fall in, is the mechanics of how your billing system works.
Okay. We don't need to dwell on that. I do notice that I see now there's also a residential net metering, and that's also pegged at 100%. I'm guessing that it's because of the dash in the left-hand column.
Right. It's the math of the far right column.
Yeah.
Right.
So that might just need a little bit of tweaking, at least in the presentation. I'll let someone else take a question. I have more.
I'm muted, sorry. Alice, did you have any questions?
I don't at the moment. I don't have any questions at the moment.
Okay. Okay.
Nor do I.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That was Peggy, right?
That was me.
Okay. All right, Gordon, did you say you had one other question?
Wendy, can I ask another question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Looking at this table, is it fair to say that if you go line by line and you see these differences, let's take the first line, residential. So costs are at 13.6 million, but we're only gaining revenue of whatever that number is, 11 point something. So there's this $2 million shortfall, $2.1 million shortfall. Does that mean, in theory, that you would then need to raise rates for that class in order to cover the unmet costs?
That is correct.
Would you decrease the rate for lines that have a positive balance on the right
Yes.
side?
And that would be something that you would want to do over a period of time. Again, doing a cost of service analysis on a regular basis to make sure the target isn't moving based on changes in customer usage patterns.
This is
So if
Peggy.
you were all things equal today, you would raise residential customer rates by that percentage, but of course you would want to smooth that out over a period of time. And again, make sure that you're heading it, based on their usage pattern, that number is not changing. Or if it does, move your rates towards that target.
So
Peggy,
this-
did I hear you
Yes, you
want to
did.
ask a question? I think that was you.
I just wanted to point out that it looks like the residential shortfall is pretty much made up with commercial general service.
Yep.
So that would be kind of a major policy decision to lower commercial general service and increase residential to make it up. That's probably would be the first time we'd ever have done any such thing.
So can I, it's a good point, Peggy. So Dave, from an institutional history perspective, this sort of cross-subsidization, has this been common in the past when we've done rate service studies, or is this somewhat of a deliberate strategy?
This has been done this way for a while. It's truly a philosophy. So what the flavor of the board is on that, it's not uncommon. Other utilities do cross subsidizations as well, but it's really a question of where the board wants to go with this.
Yep.
So
Okay.
this would be
Really all
important.
comes down, sorry.
Go ahead. Go
No,
ahead.
I was just going to say, it really all comes down to those weights, to how you allocate across rate classes. Because the bottom line, the total line, shows that we're more or less in balance. And so it's a subjective call as to how you allocate costs across these rate classes, it seems to me.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd agree. And how much of that cost is the energy versus the fixed versus other too?
So Laura has her hand raised. I think she
Oh,
probably wants to
sorry.
as well.
Laura,
So,
go right
yeah,
ahead.
thank you. So Dave mentioned that, it has historically been the pattern of previous boards to go along with this subsidy, if you will, between the general service and the residential rate class. But as we heard Russ say, he admitted that historically this was a pattern, but that was changing in the industry now, and that more and more utilities were looking at that historical cross-subsidization and questioning whether that was a policy they wanted to continue going forward.
Yep, I definitely heard that.
Yeah, and it's almost a philosophical question. I would just say, and some of that could be about the shift of, say, political deference to business versus individuals, which I don't want to get into, but to focus that on what might matter from Concord's perspective. We are all ratepayers. We are also property taxpayers, and we actually, I think, benefit from a somewhat lower property tax than some of our neighboring towns because we have commercial. And yet at the same time, for quite a while now, a lot of our commercial properties haven't been fully occupied. Maybe the electric rate could be something that would incentivize businesses to move in. So you can basically take with one and give with the other, and it could end up benefiting the town as a whole. But I'm going to stop there because I don't really feel myself that I'm qualified to say that that's going to be beneficial to anybody. So.
Yeah.
I'll raise can I raise my hand? Oh, or Alice, either one of us. Concord's one of the few, or not one of the few, but one of the towns that has an equivalent tax rate for business and residential. Many or some towns have a higher tax rate for businesses and a lower tax rate for residential. We have our uniform tax rate, so already that's fairly beneficial to businesses. Secondly, I think, well, we do have some businesses open. I think it's stretching the point to say that our residential tax rate is subsidized much by commercial. It's not.
Right.
See you, Alan. Anything else?
So I was just going to suggest that the discussion about that we're getting to here is what will be our rate design, and I think that's a big discussion that I'm not sure we have everything we need to answer the questions about that we're asking now, and I think they're important to raise them here. But I might think we would want to meet specifically on rate design and answer the policy questions. Are we comfortable with the subsidization of $2 million a year for the residential class? And the answer may be yes. But until we as a board decide what our preference and policy decision is, we can't get to the rate design. Is that right?
I mean, I think, Alice, I think you're right. There's a couple key decisions, and we knew this when Laura presented this, that there'd be some feedback from the board that Laura and David would want before they could finalize the report. And this is clearly one of them. And I'm sure there's a few others. And I don't know that we're going to do it today, but that probably is our next meeting, obviously, right? And we might want a little more information to have that conversation as well.
Laura, could you speak to the idea how we broke this components, rate design versus cost of service?
Yeah, sure. So as Russ kind of mentioned in his presentation, but I think it makes sense to reaffirm it or reemphasize it. Before we can get to the rate design pieces, which is like, okay, should we have a higher fixed charge on the residential and or general service rates? What should the time of use rate look like? How much more should the on-peak price be than the off-peak price? I mean, all these considerations that are part of what we're calling rate design follow after one has completed the cost of service study, which all it does is it says, look, based on our industry standard methods of allocation, here's how much revenue should be collected from each rate class. And so before we can get to rate design, we have to answer the fundamental question. The board has to decide, okay, for each rate class, what is the revenue target going to be? Because Baker Tilly needs to know, okay, from residential, we need to collect $2 million. And therefore, they can start designing rates that collect $2 million. But if we don't set that fixed dollar amount up front, you can imagine there'd be an infinite number of possibilities for the rate design because none of them, there'd be no target that we're trying to get to. So you can't do the rate design piece until you've done or until you've made a decision about the cost of service study. And so, you know, one reason we wanted to present the work that Baker Tilly is doing in two distinct chunks is to let you consider this cost of service study piece, the more numeric and factual, you know, black and white portion of the work, if you will, make some policy decisions if needed, and then we can move on to the more art-based work of actual rate design, which will be informed in large part by some of the social and other objectives that CMLP has in addition to pure rate recovery.
Thank you, Laura. Lynn?
I'm still hung up on the fact that a lot of the conclusions we're drawing from that chart that we were just looking at, that table we were just looking at, are a function of assumptions, are a function of weights that or allocation factors that are in the model. And I hear phrases like industry standard being used, but there's nothing, to me, there's nothing magical about those weights. I don't know where they come from, and I don't know whether they have to stay that way. We can change those weights and come up with different conclusions. If we put everybody weighted to 1, would we therefore not have to change in any rate class?
Well, if I could speak to that,
Please.
the weighting of customers, you know, just drives the customer cost. You know, a 1 versus a 5 just, you know, drives the
Sure.
amount that you allocate for cares and customer billing and things like that. The majority of the costs are allocated based on what customers use in electricity and how much peak they contribute towards CMLP's total peak. That's the biggest driver right there. When you get past those two big buckets, demand and energy, KW and kilowatt hours, then the rest of the costs are a much smaller percentage of the total of that. So, you know, the idea when it comes to rates and rate philosophy is how do you want to drive customer behavior to lower your peak, which lowers costs for everybody, and is more beneficial to the customer base as a whole. So, you know, and so I do talk about industry standards when it does come to some of those cost allocations. But I think that, you know, based on our experience, it's pretty solid as to how those are allocated. Again, they've been tweaked for your particular situation and things like that, but for the most part, you know, it's always something that could be looked at, I guess, is my point for that.
So maybe one of the things we'd want to understand is in terms of that cost, how much of that cost is really variable versus the allocation of fixed.
Yep.
I think that's kind of where that concern comes in.
And then we have some, when you do see the report, there'll be some summary schedules that when I talk about that $122 per customer for residential, well, you know, what are all the different pieces of that? And then what's the variable cost associated that you would attribute to energy? What were the costs that you would attribute to distribution maintenance and things like that? The way your rates are set up between the customer costs and capacity and transmission, distribution, and then energy. So you'll get that breakdown. And again, you know, that can always be tweaked. And I just want to reiterate that you know, you have the cost of service and the rate design, and the two they rarely are right on each other, you know, and it's the art and science of it.
Yep. We need to provide feedback eventually.
Okay.
So
Gordon has his hand
thank you,
up.
Russ. I know, Gordon, I was going to say you're next. I saw your hand.
Can you hear me? This question
Yep.
is for Russ. Could we go back to that same slide again? And I'd like to look at, first of all, I'll just make the comment to the committee that I'm amazed at how large the residential assistance cost is. Yet it's still a relatively small percentage of, say, the residential cost of service. So that's you know, if you're comparing 13,000 to 200. But then, Russ, my question for you is, I noticed that on the next line, the residential time of use, the cost of service is 46.9 thousand. The rates only collect 22.6 thousand. There's a hole of 24,000, and that's a 100% hole. Do you have any idea why it is that and I can understand for the residential assistance, that's 162% hole or deficit or whatever. That's understandable because we are deliberately charging them less for the service than it costs. But for residential time of use, I would think that should be able to pay for itself. Any idea what's going wrong there?
Yeah, all I know is that the costs are allocated based on their usage pattern, and it could be perhaps that you aren't recovering the full costs, the full fixed cost to serve those customers. But based on that, beyond that, rather, we'd have to do some more analysis of that.
Okay, and then just one other question would be: did you consider? I mean, we've had quite a lot of discussions about time of use, about tiers. That is that the idea that, and the tiers are particularly in the residential class, and the idea there being that if you are a large user, you're going to pay a higher cost. And that's purely on the, it's not on the energy piece, it's on the distribution piece. So this, I don't see that addressed here. Do you have any, and you know, maybe if we wanted to bump the residential class up, then we could knock out the lowest tier and bill everybody at the same rate as the high users, and maybe that would balance that out. I don't know. I'm not suggesting that either for the public. That was just a theoretical. So anyways, do tiered rates play in this analysis at all?
Well, they will in the rate design, but not in the cost of service. And every time you do a cost of service study, if you have tiered rates, one of the processes that you go through is to determine, do the tiers still fit? Because here we are 6 years beyond where the tiers were last calculated. And in our preliminary, we've done some preliminary work on the rate design, some analysis of some of the numbers, and your average customer usage has fallen compared to 6 years ago. And if you look at how the tiers fit when they were first designed, but if you look at the customer usage patterns for each tier, I think the bulk of your customers fall in the top tier, so the highest tier. And so, that recalculation, if you continue to want tiers for the mechanism of, versus flat rates, for the mechanism of maybe driving customer behavior through the use of tiers. In any case, they would be recalculated and looked at again as part of the rate design in this process. So,
thank you.
Hopefully I answered that okay.
I have a question. Wendy?
Alice is asking.
Yeah. Russ, I have a question. You've mentioned that industry standard and the calculation of the cost of service study is oftentimes falls back on industry standards, but you've also said that the differential allocations between commercial and residential are often skewed in the same way as it is here, but that is changing. Do you know what is changing the philosophical underpinning that large commercial and commercial industrial users would pay a higher rate to help subsidize a residential rate? Like, what's causing the industry standard to change?
I think, part of it is, the rate philosophy that perhaps we want more economic development rates, not necessarily rates, but have, we would like industry to be competitive in our town and things like that. So we want their rates to be closer to the cost of service. Another driver is that as you install more smart meters, you'll have some more data available both to you as a utility and to your customers, especially when 5G starts to get rolled out and you have your smart home and things like that. You'll be able to have rates in place that allow customers to make rate decisions rather on how they use electricity, which will drive your rates and so on. In the same with your general service customers. A lot of utilities have kind of use rates for like the large general service class where companies, especially manufacturing companies, and that can make decisions about moving their manufacturing times to more off-peak periods to save money, which in turn lowers your peak in some cases and things like that. But I think the philosophy is kind of swung the other way, more towards economic development, more data, trying to take things more closer to the cost of service.
Factors that we should probably consider when we talk more in depth about a rate design and the rate design policy that we would want to set.
Right. And I think we haven't so far said that we would have time of use for general service. And it sounds like, Russ, you're saying that in the industry, there actually is a market for that in some cases, and that's worth discussing. little separately, but.
Mhm.
All right, I'm recognizing it's 6:30, so are there other members of the board who have additional questions? Oh, I see a question. Gordon, yep.
Sure. Russ, could you go to slide 6? Yeah, and I just thought that this is an interesting, well, very useful division of what the actual components are. And I was thinking, would it be possible to think about or explain if we were previously talking about the misalignment between costs and revenue across classes. Now, there aren't any classes in this slide, but if you can combine those two, I just have kind of this seat of the pants intuitive notion that in that big 63% piece, that you're less likely to have cross subsidies or these misalignments. And the reason is that it's just the cost is just, or the revenue is just in a very straightforward way attached to the kilowatt hour consumption. And I think that in our discussion of it today, we've really been kind of assuming that too, because we were asking a lot of questions a moment ago about how the fixed costs are allocated, and that would largely fall in the area outside of that 63%, right? So I guess my question is that misallocation or that lack of alignment less for the power supply?
Well, the cost of service study can tell you, what the cost of service is for each one of these categories. So power supply, we could say this much as fixed power supply versus variable power supply. But the revenue side of the equation comes from your budget, which doesn't really break it out in that finite of a look. I suppose there's some analysis that could be done as to how much, what's your cost per kilowatt recovery or kilowatt hour recovery. I suppose on a general basis, an analysis could be I'm thinking aloud here. That's why I'm kind of
Sure. I mean, where I'm heading with this is this
there could be a way to look at it under that way, but there'll be other costs embedded in your revenue side of the equation because that's not how your budget's going. So,
well, okay. No, these are all expenses, right? There's depreciation, there's customer accounts. These are not revenues, these are expenses.
Right, so we know of each one of these pieces, how it's allocated to the various customer classes. So like power supply, at 63%, your report will have a summary that says, okay, a power supply dollars, residential gets X, general service gets Y,
okay,
this much is fixed, this much is variable, and so on. But if we compare that compared to what your revenue recovery is in your current budget, I'm saying that's what we don't have that information available.
Okay, thanks. That's all I had.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute again. All right. I think on that chart, the cost of services, I think it actually, for me anyways, I would love to see when that cost breaks down, how much of that's variable versus the fixed, just so I can understand it. I mean, I think you said the proportionate majority is variable, but it would be good to see how that fixed cost breaks out. But that could be a follow-up item. I will ask one more time. Is there any more questions from the board? And otherwise, I will take questions from the audience. All right, I am seeing none. So Brian, I see that you have raised your hand.
I can allow him to talk so I can ask his.
Oh, you want? Yeah, that would be good. That'd be helpful. Yeah, thanks.
All right.
Go ahead, Brian.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great. So Russ, I wanted to ask on the fixed charges, slide, I believe 16, and 17. So the cost of service studies that are residential costs are about $122 per customer per month.
Yes.
So what is included in your, I see the next slide talks about what is included, and you have fixed power supply as part of the inclusion.
You know, I think the best way to do this would be to show you just a sample of that page in the model. If you'll bear with me just a second here.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. So this is where we get the $122. This is like a summary schedule. It rolls up to something that looks better in the report, but for working purposes, it works pretty good. So,
okay,
so
that is helpful.
This fixed cost divided by customers per month. So this is, you know, the cost divided by the customer account.
So I can see on your spreadsheet that you have generation.
Right.
What is that?
So that would be your fixed power supply costs, pretty much. Okay.
Fixed power supply costs. So fixed power supply cost being our capacity contract and our PPAs for generation?
Yeah, pieces of them, yes, that have been identified as fixed costs, you know, in the walkthrough of the various expense accounts.
So below that, you have the variable costs, and you have a power supply, a purchase power cost of 11 cents. I believe it's 11 cents. Is that?
Yes.
Yep.
So if the energy charge for a residential customer is about 7.5 cents, including what we're doing for RECs, why is that 11? And then why do we have an additional generation charge of 51 on a fixed basis? That it just seems, I'm trying to relate, because when I look at the power supply portion of the expenses, there is 4 components. There's the transmission, the capacity, the generation contracts, and then these, what do they call them, fixed charges each year at the town meeting. This is the slide that's given. And I'm trying to understand why is that considered a fixed fee if it's an ongoing contract? And if it can be divided by the amount of energy that you're purchasing.
Well, this slide here, or this page of the spreadsheet, lists all your expenses by type. So the top of the stack here is all the energy related accounts. This account number is the account in your general ledger and this is the particular expense that goes with. And these were identified as the variable energy pieces of your power supply. And then other accounts are identified as these are fixed costs in this area right here. So your, you know, FCM cost.
Okay, so you're collecting the cost of capacity in the fixed charge.
Correct.
That's why it's so high.
That's why it's so high. So if you were to do a customer demand charge, in theory, you would take a look at that $51 and say, well, perhaps we should build a residential rate based on trying to recover that $51 based on the kilowatt usage, the demand that residential customer has on a monthly basis. Now, the only way you can do that is to have the proper metering in place to measure that, which you have for some now, but not others.
Yeah,
And you're moving in that direction with your smart meter project.
Yeah, that was when I saw this presentation in 2015 from the first report. It was this was the same issue that came up, which was lack of data. Lynn earlier had a great question about industry standards, and that seems to be being used because of the lack of granular data on customers of when they use electricity, which could relate better to the capacity expenses and thus become a variable instead of fixed. Okay. All right.
And you're headed in that direction.
Yeah, hopefully.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Brian. I know somebody else had their hand up. Was that Pamela?
David Allen.
Was it David? Sorry. David?
Yeah, I've allowed him to talk.
Okay.
He's muted though.
Hopefully that worked.
There you go. Yep.
Though you can't see me. I want to underline the thrust of Lynn's observations here. What we have so far is completely a function of allocation factors, which we don't see. They are behind the veil at this point. You may be familiar with debates about using very complicated algorithms to make policy decisions. Well, we have a situation here in which the numbers we're starting off from, our cost figures, are based on, I don't know how complicated or uncomplicated, that's beside the point, a set of allocation factors that you yourselves, the decision makers, don't have your hands on. I think Laura probably does, and that's our crucial link. And Laura might indeed be able to bring to the surface for you, you decision makers, what those are. Brian has already picked up on this notion of industry standard allocation factors, which Lynn pointed to along the way. Yes, they may be industry standard, but we ain't standard. We are what we are. Brian brings up the challenge to us that we don't have a lot of granular data to build from. Bottom line, until we, the folks out here, the public you serve, are comfortable with those allocation factors, and therefore, until you are comfortable with those allocation factors are, and again, I hope Laura is our bridge to get there, it doesn't look to me as if we can say yay to these specific cost and revenue numbers. An additional point, which we're all very long-term familiar with, but needs to be said even at this stage, with regard to Russell, the objective you pointed out with regard to getting more accurate allocation of fixed cost. Yes, certainly it does signal to users, us out here, as you say, the value of the investment that the light plant makes. But this goes back a decade. Once again, these are discussions we've had for a long, long time, over and over and over again. The real driving motivation here is to get accurate dollar signals for the management and policy setting at the light plant. We spent an entire year going around in circles because of a failure to accurately allocate fixed cost. That is the driving purpose here. All these other purposes can be important, but the driving purpose here is to get accurate cost signals into the policy process. Not that it makes a big difference right now, but I hope that that will help triangulate as you think about this. Thanks very much.
Pamela has her hand up, Pamela Dritt.
And Wendy, you're muted.
Sorry. So who has their hand up? I'm sorry.
Pamela Dritt.
Pamela. Okay, go ahead, Pamela. Sorry.
Hi, thank you. This is fascinating. I appreciate all of that. And the questions that Brian typed into the chat were also interesting. I want to know what our overall future from a way backed off camera lens is. Do we want to get to the point where Concord essentially generates all of our electricity clean, most of our energy usage is electric, and the light plant is simply managing the infrastructure and distributing it, so that the actual cost of electricity is essentially all in the infrastructure itself? Because don't we have to incentivize, we're already incentivizing electric vehicles and electric heat pump and things like that installations, but don't we also have to have the infrastructure to hold all of the residential solar that our residents want to invest in, to the benefit of all of us eventually, by creating clean energy? So one thing I would think we would not want to do is disincentivize residents to install solar by charging them high prices for their fixed costs, which everybody should pay, without giving them big payments for the solar energy that they produce that would compensate for the fixed costs that they get charged. In other words, we don't want to economically disincentivize people from investing in solar arrays. And we also want to include the fixed costs of the operating costs of the light plant with the salaries and all of that into fixed shares of costs that aren't so much based on energy usage. I'm not explaining very well. How do we incentivize what behavior? Which behavior do we want to incentivize? And what kind of ultimate future do we want to get to? And how do we incentivize that happening economically? No.
Wendy, you're muted.
I'm trying to keep my house noise out of the picture and it's not working. Pamela, I think you raised some good questions, and I think those issues and questions are what is all part of the rate design aspect of this project. So good comment though. Are there other hands raised that I'm not seeing, Dave, that I'm, okay. So Dave, I want to just mention one thing now. I mean, I think we have you're looking for some feedback from the board, and I know our next meeting would be in July. Do we think that we need to meet sooner than that to give you some feedback so you can keep this project going? I'm just raise that question.
I would be open to a second meeting in June. I know there's some other topics that we haven't got to. This topic was a big one and was going to take up most of the meeting. But other things that we need to talk about. And, I think this format worked pretty well. It's our first run at it, but
yep,
we did a pretty good job. So, if the board has availability and is willing to have a second meeting in June, I think it would help us with getting some decisions made around the cost of service study, and some other things that we need to discuss as well.
Okay. And I'm assuming this cost allocation is one of them, and you may have a few other topics that we would queue up for that. What is the board's, we're not going to poll people on availability, but are you open to meeting maybe in 2 weeks? That's a positive, Lynn. Yeah. Peggy, does that work for you? Looks like all around we're okay. Okay.
I'm not going anywhere.
Okay. Well, this is true. None of us are. All right. So we can do some polling and figure out what times work best for everybody. So, all right, we'll take that as an action. All right. So anything else? Any other liaison reports from anyone? I don't know that there are.
I do not believe we have any liaisons right now.
Yeah. Well, the finance committee, the audit committee has not met, so none.
No, but I do want to thank Russ for the presentation. It's really, really useful to start peeling away some of the veil over cost of service study. And thank you for helping us to understand that.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind comments. And thank you for your questions too. Our goal is always to make it as understandable as possible. And it's kind of a technical topic. And we always struggle with that a bit to make sure that, the right points are being hit and the right areas are being focused on. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Right.
And Gordon has his hand raised.
Gordon?
Yes, thanks. Just quickly, I'm a little concerned that the world has shifted really, really radically since the last time we met. And energy prices have collapsed. Maybe they're recovering a bit. And if they do that, then that big 63% piece of that pie that we're talking about, the costs associated with that big slice are going to shrink, right? So anyway, and maybe things will all return to the way they were a year ago in a year. But there's a lot of uncertainty in my mind about what the future of costs are on the energy side. I think that I feel more confident about the overhead piece because salaries don't change, and that's pretty relatively stable. So is that an input at all, Russ, into your analysis?
Well, if the amount of power supply costs would change, a piece of that would be variable, a piece of that would be fixed, that would impact things as well. So it's however you change your budget for that. Right now, it's based on your budget for 2020.
So you're not using future gas prices?
No, no, we used, like I said, when we started this process, when the revenue requirement was deemed okay, that was before the world kind of squirrely like it is now. So that's where it is right now.
Okay. All right.
Wendy?
We have an open question in the Q&A.
Sorry.
Can I make a comment, Wendy, on
Yes.
Gordon's question before you move on to the next?
Sure. Go ahead, Laura.
Gordon, don't forget that 50 to 80% of our power supply is fixed already, and that only 20% is floating with market prices. So as market prices collapse, it does impact our portfolio costs, but only to the extent of 20%, not 100%.
Thank you.
Good reminder.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, and then Dave, I did actually see the question from Brian, which was a reminder about our decision around rec purchases. And that would probably be a good topic for our next meeting.
It is one of the topics that I was going to add to the agenda. I would just mention that it's a typo. It's 0.005. It's
I thought so. Thank you.
So I knew what he meant. Typo. So that would be an agenda item for the next June meeting.
Okay, great. And then Dave, I just wanted to ask one question just to give an update. The RFP, obviously, for that meter, that hasn't really gone anywhere. I just want to give a quick update on that, right? You haven't had any capacity, I'm assuming.
No, that's I'm a little frustrated, to be honest, but that's an example of some things that just are not, we don't have enough time to get to right now. It's really difficult, and it just keeps delaying the end result. So Yep. It's on our list and it's high on the priorities, but we haven't had the capacity to finish that up.
Yep.
Dave, can I just say it's a miracle that our lights come on whenever we our switch, given all the other craziness in the world right now. So I know it's a stressful time, but from one resident of the town to you, thank you.
You're welcome.
Right.
Here.
Agreed.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Great.
All
right.
Laura
Sorry,
has
Dave?
her hand up too.
Laura, sorry.
I had just wanted to respond to Gordon's question, and that's already been done, because I wasn't going to let you go by, even though you hadn't seen my hand, so I just butted in.
It's okay.
And we do have one more hand raised from David Allen.
Okay, David. Thank you, Dave.
And
Right. Thank you, Times. And Russell, terrific that you're setting the town up so that it can do cost of service going down the road. Presumably more or less itself, really. That's very striking to hear. Thanks.
That's good. Thank
But
you.
especially to Dave and the whole crew, just to add one little bit over here. Just up the road from us, somebody had a backhoe problem and cut through a line somehow or another. I don't know exactly what it was. The CMOP was over here and repaired it. It might have been in an instant. It was really amazingly quick. And this is in the face of all the strain that you're facing right now. Just to reinforce what Len is saying, thank you so much. What a strain you're dealing with, and you're making it happen. Thanks.
you're welcome.
Yes, absolutely.
From all of
Kudos.
us.
You know,
All right.
That is a tribute to the type of staff we have and the work they put in and the dedication. And the pure fact that we're, operating, about 40% and getting through difficult times is very impressive.
Yes, amazing. Great. Great job. All right, I think we're out of agenda items. I don't think I see any more hands. So I will entertain a motion to adjourn. So moved. Any seconds?
Second.
All right, we are adjourned.
No, we need a roll
Right.
call vote. Because
We
we're
need a
on
roll
Zoom.
call vote to
We
adjourn?
do, because we're on
Really?
Zoom.
Okay.
Yeah,
so-
every vote requires a roll call in the webinar.
Oh, all right, in the webinar. All right, well,
Bye.
Alice?
Aye.
Aye.
George? Peggy, was that you? Okay, and I. All right, we're done. All right,
Thanks,
thank you
everyone.
all. Thank you for
thank
your
you all.
patience. Thank you,
Have a
Dave,
good
and
evening.
thank you, Laura, and Russ also for all the work on that study. I know it's a ton of work.
Yeah.
More to
Thank you,
follow
guys.
too.
I appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.